Can you hear me back there? Okay. All right, just making sure. Is that okay?
Just yell into the mic.
I'll do that. Thank you, Mark, for that introduction and for your invitation to present here, and welcome everyone. Thanks for taking time to attend this event. I was asked to speak on India and Pakistan relations. In itself, a very broad and complex topic. And so one has to make certain deliberate choices in terms of what to focus on. Of course, the Kashmir dispute is central to India-Pakistan relations. The Great Decisions book, actually, the chapter on India-Pakistan has an entire section on Kashmir. One of the things that is mentioned in that section, one of the things that is raised in the section is whether whether the Kashmir issue is actually just something that India and Pakistan can resolve bilaterally by themselves, or does the international community have a role to play in terms of settlement of that dispute? Okay? At the end of the chapter, out of the 6 questions, 5 questions are regarding the role of the international community in terms of, if there is one, in terms of trying to settle this matter. So I thought, why not focus on something like this? So, I'm essentially talking about whether the international community has any kind of role to play in this particular dispute in terms of helping the two countries settle. Okay. In the process, I'll talk to you a little bit about the Kashmir dispute, and of course, if you have questions about the past or what's happened in the past or more recent events, please feel free to ask me. This is just I guess a small part of the Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan. So I'm arranging my presentation sort of in this format. Start with just giving you some background in terms of the Kashmir dispute, and then move on to talking about third-party mediation, a historical overview of that, what the international community has done in terms of trying to get India and Pakistan to resolve the issue. And then, of course, third-party mediation usually works when both actors are willing to sort of go down that path. But India has objected very strenuously, and for a long time now, actually, decades now, in terms of objected strenuously against third-party mediation. So why that is the case is something I wanted to share with you. And finally, sort of what would be the, I guess, appropriate manner in which the international community can help the two countries settle the dispute. Okay, I have a map of Kashmir here. This map, of course, is now a little bit changed, but this what you see in terms of those red boundaries, that was the original kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir, and that's where my story essentially starts. The kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir was a semi-independent kingdom. It was not part of British India. You had actually 560 plus semi-independent kingdoms, out of which Jammu and Kashmir was actually one of the largest. Okay. At the time of independence, 1947, the British gave these 560 plus kingdoms a choice whether they wanted to join Pakistan, which was going to be a new country in 1947, or they wanted to be part of India, or they wanted to be independent. The choice was given to the rulers, usually princes or maharajas. Okay, so the same choice was given to the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir, that individual, the picture that you see there, Maharaja Hari Singh. Now, for most of those kingdoms, it was a relatively easy decision. a lot of those kingdoms were located smack in the center of India or Pakistan, and demographically it was, again, there was not much difference. So most of the kingdoms, none of the kingdoms really retained their independence. Most were absorbed, all of them actually were absorbed with either India or Pakistan. Now, Maharaja Hari Singh, his situation was kind of unique because Jammu and Kashmir was a majority Muslim kingdom, but the Maharaja himself was a Hindu. Right? Now, when it came for him to decide what to do, he preferred to remain independent. He did not want to join either India or Pakistan. Okay? 1947, August 1947 is when India and Pakistan gained their independence. In the spring of 1947, an uprising begins in the far western side of his kingdom that essentially borders the province of Punjab, which was going to become Pakistan. Right? It also borders the northwest frontier province, which today is Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. There's an uprising. The uprising primarily because of anger, resentment against the Maharaja, difficult economic times, but very high taxes, and not many prospects for employment for the young. So it's an economic crisis that actually sort of first results in the uprising, but it gets quickly caught up in the evolving situation, the communal clashes that erupt across India, Hindus and Muslims essentially at each other's throats. So an economic problem quickly spirals into a political crisis. Those people that essentially are raising a banner of revolt against the Maharaja, they want the kingdom to join Pakistan. Right? In the summer, or actually getting into the fall season in 1947, the Maharaja's kingdom is invaded by Pashtun tribesmen. As I said, the northwest frontier province is just next door. Tens of thousands of tribesmen invade his kingdom. The common, acceptance of this period of history is that they're supported by the newly sort of created government in Pakistan. Right? The Maharaja requests India for assistance because his own troops are unable to fend off the invasion. India says, well, the government of India, Prime Minister Nehru says, we can help you, but only if you sign a treaty. It's called the Instrument of Accession. If you sign a treaty, you become part of India, then we can dispatch troops to sort of protect you from these tribesmen. Right? And as it says in 26th October 1947, the Maharaja signs the treaty and India dispatches troops. There's a conflict between those tribesmen and Indian sort of soldiers. The advance is stopped, and then a few months later, regular Pakistani troops sort of enter into the conflict. So the first war, the first India-Pakistan War, 1948, erupts. Okay? The conclusion of the war, Jammu and Kashmir, the king, the Maharaja, has signed the treaty, but his kingdom is divided, and you can see that divide, and that holds true for today as well. The northern one-third portion of his kingdom today is effectively part of Pakistan. The southern two-third that you see is part of India. Right? So you have a divided kingdom. That's not the only war. There are two other wars directly related to Kashmir, 1965 and 1999. I'm not including the 1971 war, which leads to the creation of Bangladesh. That's not fought on Kashmir. These are three wars that are fought on Kashmir. Right? Another prominent event in this story, 1989, July of 1989, an insurgency that some people call freedom struggle, some people call an insurgency or a terrorist movement, depending on where you stand, erupts you can see this part, maybe if I just go back here a little bit. Sorry. The Kashmir Valley. So that portion, hopefully, that you can see in between, sort of in the center of the kingdom. An insurgency erupts, and it's a very brutal conflict. In response to the insurgency, India sends tens of thousands of troops into this part of the country. The insurgency is still ongoing, but it's much what you might describe as a low-level insurgency compared to the early 1990s. Okay. Nevertheless, anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 people have been killed in this insurgency. The goal of the rebellion has been essentially to either achieve independence for Kashmir or, again, depending on who's fighting, have Kashmir join with Pakistan. Okay. Of course, India has resisted that. There have been several bilateral initiatives to try and find a way forward. Some of these initiatives predate in 1989, some after 1989, but none of them have actually been very successful. The dispute persists. Now, the most significant event in recent times, and perhaps people here would have questions about that, is this deoperationalization, essentially, of Article 370. Right? Article 370 was essentially the link between India and this Jammu and Kashmir state. Article 370, very briefly, grants the state of Jammu and Kashmir certain powers that other states of India do not have. Article 370 was negotiated between Kashmiri leaders and the drafters of India's constitution. So it essentially went into force the same time that India's constitution went into force, which is 1950. Article 370 states that apart from foreign affairs, defense, and communications, no other powers are delegated to the government of India, to the union government or the federal government of India. The application of the Indian constitution is severely restricted. Okay, that was the original sort of plan, but of course over time Article 370 has been eroded. Today it no longer exists, and we can come back to this, of course, if you have something in the question answer session. Article 370, I hope you can read what it says here. What Article 370 did, of course, was to recognize that Kashmir could have, Jammu and Kashmir, the state could have its own flag, it could have its own constitution, and it says here dual citizenship, but actually that's not entirely correct. There is a provision of permanent residence of Kashmir, but there is only one Indian citizenship. I mean, Kashmiri residents do not carry a different passport. They are all citizens of India. There's no special notification in their passports. So dual citizenship here is actually not correct. There's a lot of misconception about what happens in this part of the world. Today, the state of Jammu and Kashmir is no longer actually even a state. It's a union territory. Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Union territories are very much like territories that you have here in the United States. But most of the union territories do not have self-governance. They are administered by the federal government. There's some local level political powers, but it's not in the same category as most states. Most states in India have their own legislature bodies, very much like what you have here. It's a federal system, very much like the United States. But Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, two union territories today, don't have the same powers. And so there's been a lot of anguish about that. A lot of what you may have read in the news about Kashmir pertain to that change of status revoking is probably not the right word again, voiding or deoperationalizing 370 and changing the status of the state is something that has been criticized heavily within India as well as outside India. Now, in terms of third-party mediation, like the conflict persists between India and Pakistan. It's not been resolved. And so lots of people ask, like, wouldn't it be a better idea to have the international community step in to try and resolve the matter? Again, as I said, the problem essentially lies because with India, because it does not want to participate in any form of like mediation efforts, right? In terms of the history, there has been UN mediation in the past, and perhaps some of you are aware of this or you are not. When Kashmir joins India, the government of India under Nehru brings the issue to the UN Security Council, right? There's a conflict raging, and what the hope of the government of India is that the UN Security Council will actually call out Pakistan. As far as India is concerned, the situation is very clear. The Maharaja has signed a treaty. It's a legal process. There's nothing wrong with this process. What we have to focus on now is this aggression from Pakistan, right? In January 1948, the issue is brought to the UN Security Council. The first thing that it does, Resolution 38, as it says here, asks the two sides to maintain status quo, to not change things around, to wait for the United Nations to take a more active role. The UN also, almost immediately, Resolution 39, establishes what is called a UN Commission for India and Pakistan, so UNCIP, right? One three-member commission, one chosen by India, the other person chosen by Pakistan, and the third by the UN Security Council, right? The more important thing, though, is Resolution 47. This is April 1948, and this is the UN Security Council's roadmap, if you will, to resolve the issue. What the roadmap is, what the resolution is that there's three components. The first step is it asks Pakistan to withdraw its troops and also its local militias completely from the territory, right? So, going back here, you can see the division in this map. It's called Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. In some places, it's Pakistan-administered Kashmir, or some other name is used. The story is the same in 1948 as it is today. Pakistan occupies one-third of the state. And so the UN Security Council resolution asks Pakistan to essentially withdraw. And then it calls for India to reduce the number of its own troops to a bare minimum, only as much as is necessary to maintain law and order. Okay, so we're talking about a few thousand troops, really. Like the bulk of the law and order maintenance, which should be carried out by local troops, local soldiers. The third and final component is about holding a plebiscite, a referendum, to allow the Kashmiris to decide what they would like. So plebiscite not just in the valley, the Kashmir Valley, but across the entire state. Okay. Now, India is bitterly disappointed in terms of the outcome, because here's the thing. The government of India was happy to, I guess they were not displeased with the idea of a plebiscite, right? A referendum. Nehru's government was confident that most Kashmiris would choose India ahead of Pakistan, right? So they weren't really that bothered with that. What they were bothered with was the UN's decision to treat India and Pakistan on par. Whereas India expected the UN Security Council to condemn Pakistan's action because it felt that what it was doing was perfectly legal. The Maharaja had signed the treaty, he had requested troops to protect his kingdom, and that's why we are there. There is no valid reason for the Pakistani troops to be there, right? So that does not happen, and there's a lot of disappointment about that, right? So there's disagreements about Pakistan's standing, right? There's also disagreement about demilitarization. The first part of Resolution 47 asks Pakistan to completely withdraw troops. But Pakistan is not willing to do that, right? It argues that what we need to do is essentially a phased with demilitarization. Both of us do it at the same time, as opposed to I go first and then you go first. And again, India is not willing to go down that path, right? And so that last step, having a plebiscite, itself becomes null and void. If Pakistan is not fulfilling, as far as India is concerned, if Pakistan is not fulfilling its part of the bargain, why should we withdraw our troops? And then why should we have a plebiscite, a referendum? There is no way a referendum could be constituted as fair when you have troops, Pakistani troops, tribesmen, sort of in this state. So they are bound to actually influence the electorate, right? So differences over the demilitarization process, who should withdraw first, who should stay on, disagreements about Pakistan's standing. As far as India is concerned, Pakistan has no standing on this issue, okay? It's a matter between India and the Kashmiri people, and that's why it agrees to a referendum, a plebiscite, right? The other problem, of course, over time is the neutrality of the mediators. We have actually 3 mediators that were part of the process. The first person on your left is General Andrew McNaughton. He's a Canadian sort of soldier, is a veteran of the Second World War. Brief mediation efforts. Sir Owen Dixon, an Australian jurist, was also appointed by the UN Security Council. So this is April through September of 1950. And then Senator Frank Graham, was a US senator, and he led, I guess, the most strongest effort to find a way to have eventually a plebiscite. But it did not work out, right? Again, the two countries couldn't agree upon demilitarization. And if you don't have demilitarization, you cannot have a free and fair vote, right? So we never really get to that that stage, that third and final stage. The additional problem, of course, is that the United Nations at this time is primarily dominated by Western powers. By the 1950s, the Cold War has already started, and Pakistan has already presented itself as an ally to the United States against the Soviet Union, right? And so India is no longer convinced that the members of the Security Council can be expected to be impartial anymore, right? The United States and the United Kingdom, again, Cold War politics, the neutrality of these mediators is in question, particularly Senator Frank Graham, being an American, okay? So eventually the mediation effort fails. There's another effort in 1962-63, this time by 2 countries, not the Security Council, United States and the United Kingdom. There's many frustrating meetings. In the end, the American ambassador to India, requests the Prime Minister of India to have a referendum in the Kashmir Valley only to decide independence, and Prime Minister Nehru says nothing of that sort will happen. I'm not going to only have a referendum in this area that we control, right? If you want the UN resolution to count, first get the Pakistanis to withdraw, right? So for a variety of reasons, India has not had, I guess, a very good experience when it comes to mediation. The first and foremost thing it was hoping was condemnation of Pakistan. It never really happened. So this was the view. India today claims Kashmir as an internal matter. It argues that the Maharaja signed the agreement as the British asked and expected all of these kingdoms to do, right? Kashmir has its own constitution. Kashmiris helped draft the constitution. So they had a constituent assembly, a little bit like, if you think about the Philadelphia Convention, where you sort of draft the constitution. In that Constituent Assembly, before it was dissolved, the members ratified, in some sense, Kashmir's accession to India. So as India would say, look, it's not just the Maharaja, but the people that drafted the constitution for Kashmir, the separate constitution, they also said yes. So you have an agreement and you have ratification. Right? And they point out that there have been multiple elections, state assembly elections, and Kashmiris have turned out in numbers to vote for their preferred candidates and political parties. So we may not have had a referendum, but if you take all of these three things into account, it essentially demonstrates that Kashmiris, for the most part, are happy being a part of India. Right? It's not always necessary to have a referendum, and in any case, we cannot have a referendum, and there's a lot of water that has flown down the bridge. Demographically, the Indian side of Kashmir looks different from what it did in 1948. Mass migration of Hindus, 300 to 400,000 Hindus have left after the insurgency started. And on the Kashmiri side, it's really not, they're not a majority anymore. Punjabis are the plurality. So demographically, Kashmir is very different from what it used to be in 1948. So all the more reason doesn't make any sense. There have been other agreements, disputes should be settled bilaterally. That's always been India's contention. In these agreements that were signed with Pakistan, that was put forward. So that's another reason why India says no to third-party mediation. I've told you about the failures of the past. And then the three reasons that have to generally do with mediation. India is suspicious of outside actors. No matter how impartial they may appear to be, every actor has certain self-interest, especially when you're talking about great powers like the United States or Russia or China. They all have their own interests, right? And that is going to be part of the mix. And again, that makes India very uncomfortable, right? Its self-perception as a rising power, as an emerging power, perhaps one day becoming a great power, means that it's hesitant to accept some other countries' help. Like, again, great powers do not accept mediation. The United States is unlikely to accept mediation by other countries when it comes to Iran. It wants to deal directly with Iran. Okay? Weaker countries, smaller countries, they don't mind so much. But if you think of yourself as a rising power, you feel like, I can resolve my disputes. Again, if you cannot resolve your disputes, then there's a question regarding your claim as a great power. Right? And then finally, with how the situation stands today, any kind of mediation will involve India conceding more than Pakistan would, because India is the status quo power. Right? In terms of loss of territory, it's probably going to be India, not so much Pakistan. So when you know that the outcome of a settlement would be you making greater concessions than the other side, okay, you can work perhaps to sort of balance the outcome. If you're just working one-on-one, it's harder to do so when you have like other parties. So that's another reason. Because you feel like you will make greater concessions, you don't want to go down that path. Right? In any case, it's an internal matter. It's our own state, is the government of India's argument. Disputes, if any, we will settle with Pakistan. It's bilateral. Right? We don't need busybodies essentially jumping in, right? Plus, the understanding is they don't really have much knowledge about local conditions. So this is the reason why India rejects. Third-party mediation has been put forward very recently by the UN's Secretary General, who's visiting Pakistan. When he said that, the Pakistanis were overjoyed, and as far as the Indians were concerned, immediate rejoinder. Thanks, but no thanks. We can do this by ourselves. Okay, and so this is sort of to conclude, I guess. I'm on more time for questions that I'm sure you might have instead of me talking about one particular topic. There are different kinds of mediators, so I'm bringing sort of my political science background here. Sort of an academic way of looking at mediation. Arbitrator. An arbitrator is unacceptable as far as India is concerned. An arbitrator is one that dictates sort of a settlement and that you're obligated to do so, right? You don't have much choice. That is simply unacceptable to India. Even the other one, a mediator, so the kind like we'd say, in the previous slide, Norway, the Norwegians, let's say, mediating between Israelis and Palestinians, even that is unacceptable. So someone that facilitates a negotiated settlement in official capacity is unacceptable. What is acceptable, though, is a conciliator sort of status. A neutral third party, again, if there can be a neutral third party, that's another question, who provides informal communication links. So back-channel diplomacy, quiet diplomacy. The United States can play a role in terms of activating its embassy in New Delhi, in Islamabad, in Pakistan, asking the two sides to engage with each other. We call it track 2 diplomacy sometimes, but back-channel diplomacy, I think, is the proper word, to see if we can get talks started. I think that's as far as the international community can do. It can promote bilateral dialogue and can insist that Kashmiris play some kind of role in the dialogue process. But that's all it can do. I mean, again, promotion, encouragement. It can work to prevent an escalation of conflict in case tensions rise. It can also ask Pakistan to focus on terrorism-related issues and India to focus on human rights abuses in the Kashmir Valley. But that's the extent here, right? Unfortunately, there really isn't much of a role that the international community can play, right? And given the history, there's not much hope in that things will actually turn out better because the UN Security Council experience hasn't, as you can see, really helped. Okay, so this is what I sort of wanted to get across, and as I said, I'm open to questions, any questions you have about this topic or something related to India, Pakistan, Kashmir. To the best of my knowledge, I can try and explain that. So, do you want to?